Good morning, this is Ben Caton with Clarity Farms, Grazing 365, coming to you from Central Arkansas. It's August 11th. We're having some great weather. It's unseasonably cool today. It's overcast. It's just a nice day for man and beast compared to what we normally see this time of year. So I wanted to do a video today. If you watch our videos, you're aware that we practice non-selective grazing. Some call it non-selective ultra high density grazing. And by doing so, we tend to graze, we shoot for 85 or 90% utilization in a pasture. In other words, we try to use 85 to 90% of the forage in the pasture. And if you follow grazing much, you know that's counter to what a lot of quote unquote grazing gurus recommend. And I wanted to discuss that and clarify some things because nothing against the other grazers on YouTube or out there on podcasts, but practicing selective grazing and leaving behind residue made a lot of sense until about 10 years ago when research came out that changes the way we think about the carbon and feeding your soil. So I don't want to get into all of that today. What I do want to discuss is overgrazing, because that is the most common objection I get. By grazing that much forage, people accuse us of overgrazing our pastures, of leaving bare soil, and it's just simply not true. In fact, I'm going to make a statement that is 100% true, but it will leave a lot of folks scratching their heads. And I want to make the statement and we'll discuss it and I'll explain what I mean. So here's a statement. The more grass and forage that you leave behind when you leave a paddock or a pasture, the more likely you are, in fact, I would say you'd almost be guaranteed to overgraze. The less forage you leave behind in a pasture, the less likely you are to overgraze. See, I told you, a lot of you would be scratching your heads. How is it that the more we leave behind, the more likely we are to overgraze? So, before I go into the explanation, there's a principle that's important to understand so that my explanation makes sense. So what I've done today is, if you follow my channel, you know I've practiced pretty much every style of grazing out there. Take half, leave half, adaptive grazing, graze a third, trample a third, leave a third, non-selective grazing, which is what we practice now. We've tried pretty much all those methods over the years and have settled on non-selective grazing. And one of the principles that's important to understand is that by nature, cattle are selective grazers. If you turn cattle loose in a new pasture or a new paddock, they are going to naturally go for one of two things first. They're either going to go for the most palatable, tastiest forages, or they're going to go for forages that their body's telling them they need because there's something in that forage that their body desires. So they're either going to go for the best stuff or the healthiest stuff first. And then they're going to work their way down that hierarchy. They're going to graze that stuff down to the ground. And then they're going to work their way to the next most palatable, then the next most palatable. And they're going to work their way all the way down that hierarchy until they graze off the least desirable stuff. It would be great if cattle were like lawnmowers and you could just turn them loose in a paddock and they would graze everything evenly, but that's not the way they operate. Cattle are selective grazers. So here's a great example. So what I've done is yesterday I gave them, if you notice, we don't have them packed in tightly today. And that's because I gave them a paddock that represents what I would have given them years ago when I practiced a third style selective grazing. So back when I would encourage the cattle to try to graze a third of the forage, trample a third of the forage, and leave a third of the forage. So that is a type of selective grazing because we're allowing the cattle to select what they want to graze and select what they want to refuse to graze. And here's a perfect example. So if you followed my channel, you know this is our first year on this lease. So the pastures are really poor. This is a very degraded farm. And this particular pasture was a hayfield years ago, Bermuda hayfield. But because they just hayed it into the ground, the Bermuda became more and more sparse and was replaced by less desirable grass species like Dallas grass, foxtail. We've got horse nettle in here. We've got all sorts of undesirable stuff just because the pasture's in such poor condition. This is our 4th time through, and what we're seeing is the Bermuda has been increasing not only in quantity, but the spacing between the plants. It's becoming much denser, but it's still got a long way to go. We won't get it all right this year. It's going to be a multi-year process. But if you look, the Bermuda is the most palatable grass that we've got in this paddock. And I haven't just learned that from observation. Here's the evidence. So, if you look where the Bermuda is, they have basically nuked it and grazed it to the ground. And just a few feet away where the Dallas grass and horse nettle is, and there's some foxtail over there, where they have access to the less palatable forages, they just basically refused them. So they grazed the good stuff to the ground, and they have left behind and refused the less palatable forages. So they've made the decision what they're going to graze and not graze. Because I didn't make the decision for them by packing them in tightly and requiring them to graze everything, they've decided what they want and they don't want. So back when I grazed a third, it would now be time to move the cattle out of this paddock because they've grazed at least a third of the forage that was available on offer to them. So let's say we moved them out. What would we be leaving behind? We would have hammered our best stuff, and we would have allowed our least desirable species to not only go to seed, but to shade out our good stuff. So here, here's more Bermuda that's just been grazed to the ground. And these Dallas grass plants are going to shade some of that out in its regrowth. So that's the important principle to learn as I make our explanation. So cattle are selective grazers. They are going to come in and graze the good stuff to the ground if you let them before they really even touch the less desirable grasses. So now that we understand that, let's go back to that original statement I made. The more grass you leave behind, the more forage you leave behind, the more likely you are to overgraze. And the less grass you leave behind, the less forage you leave behind, the less likely you are to overgraze. So to demonstrate, let's create a hypothetical situation. Let's pretend we have 2 identical herds of cattle, and both of them are on 2 separate farms, but the farms are identical. So identical herds on identical farms. The only difference between the 2 herds, one is grazing selectively a third, grazing a third, trampling a third, leaving a third behind. And the other herd, herd number 2, is grazing 85 or 90% of the available forage in each pasture before it moves to the next paddock. So, having said that, if we were to graze both herds in each of those fashions, which herd would make its way around the farm first and end up right back here in this paddock? Well, that's a rhetorical question. Obviously, the herd that's only grazing a third of the forage is going to make their way around the farm much faster than the group who's grazing 85 or 90% of the forage. So that herd that's selectively grazing would make their way back into this paddock. And keep in mind what we left behind. We left behind our good stuff weakened and grazed to the ground, and our the worst stuff has been allowed to, shade out the good stuff. It's been allowed to go to seed. It's been allowed to go deeper with its roots. And do you think when that group comes back into this paddock, they're going to collectively decide, you know what? We grazed the Bermuda so hard last time we were in here. Let's focus on the horse nettle and the Dallas grass and the foxtail. No, they're not going to come in and graze that way. They're going to come back in on the next rotation, and they're going to do exactly what they did on their previous graze. They're going to come in here, and they're going to hammer this Bermuda grass again. And they are going to refuse as much of the undesirable grasses as we let them refuse. So, not only are they back into this paddock sooner, they're going to repeat the behavior that they had. And so when we leave after that second pass, we've now weakened the Bermuda some more, and we've put it at even a deeper competitive disadvantage to these because they're going to refuse the same plants they refused the first time if they're allowed to. So what happens is you get into a cycle where you're coming back to your paddocks sooner than you otherwise would. And every time you leave a paddock, you're leaving the good stuff at a disadvantage. Now, let's talk about herd number 2, the herd that's utilizing 85 or 90% of its forage. Now, herd number 2 isn't going to graze the good stuff any harder than the third group. I mean, here's what the third group has done on Bermuda. They've taken it to the ground. So the group that's grazing 85 or 90% of the forage, they're going to take the Bermuda to the ground also. The difference is they're also going to take all this non-desirable stuff down to the ground. So that when they leave the paddock, they are not, the Bermuda is not at a competitive disadvantage. The Bermuda's got just as much opportunity as the less desirable grasses. So they come back, they come back into a paddock that's much more evenly distributed as far as the makeup of the forage, but also because they went around the farm more slowly, these grasses have had more time to recover, which means grow more leaf, but also they've had more time to use that new leaf to store more energy in their roots. And I know a lot of you are already thinking, because we've had it drilled into our head as grazers, yeah, but Ben, you're grazing off your solar collector. You've got to get that out of your head. Number one, that's bad science. And that's going to be another video for another day. That's not how grass regrows. It doesn't use the solar collector to regrow new leaf. It regrows new leaf with the energy in its roots and its crown. And as long as you've given it ample recovery time, you don't need the solar collector to grow more leaf because the plant already has enough energy. But in the third system, this Bermuda that's been grazed down to the ground, because we're getting back to it sooner, even if it has grown new leaf, it may not have had time to restore the energy to its roots. So when it gets grazed again, it probably will have either been weakened or killed because it didn't have enough time to store the energy in its roots. It's not about leaving a solar collector. Folks, we have got to redefine what it means when most people hear the word overgraze. Overgrazing does not mean that you have grazed a plant too short. Overgrazing means you've grazed a plant before you gave it enough time to fully recover from the last time you grazed it. And you are far less likely to overgraze your good stuff if you graze everything in the paddock, because one, your good stuff's no longer at a competitive disadvantage, and two, the slower you move around the farm, the healthier your good stuff becomes, and the better it will compete with the less desirable forages. So if you want to overgraze, graze selectively, graze in a way that they're going to come in and hammer the good stuff and leave the bad stuff. There is no selective grazing system, whether it's take half, leave half, graze a third, leave a third, trample a third, adaptive grazing. There is no selective, and those are all just variations of selective grazing, because in each of those systems, the cattle are getting to choose what to graze and what to leave behind. Some are more selective than others, so take half, leave half. By grazing half instead of grazing a third, that you would graze in a third, it's less selective, but it's still selective. You've got to take the choice out of the cattle's hands or hooves. You've got to take the choice as to what to graze out of their decision-making, and you need to take charge of the decision-making on what they're going to graze and not graze. And the most efficient way to your wallet, the best to improve your forage and the best to improve your soil is to not give them any choice at all. To force them to graze what you put in front of them, because you're going to move around your farm or ranch slower. That's going to give your good stuff more time to recover. And it's also going to put pressure on the junk. In a third system, we are not putting pressure by grazing this way. I did not put any pressure on the junk. The only grass that got pressure on it was the good stuff. This is what leads to overgrazing, not grazing everything. If you want to, if you're worried about your solar collector, folks, stop. And also, if you're worried about bare soil, so here's an example. They've grazed this Bermuda down, but there's no bare soil out here. This is exactly what the entire pasture would look like if we grazed non-selectively. It wouldn't be this haphazard, where you've got one area grazed down to the ground of all the good stuff and all the bad stuff has just been left almost untouched. I mean, they've come in here to the bad stuff and they selectively, plucked some leaves off, but they've left most of it behind. And, additionally, by grazing non-selectively, and you leave almost no stems behind. If you want really, really bad forage, leave a bunch of stems behind when you leave a paddock. The more stems you leave behind, the worse your regrowth is going to be, and the more susceptible you're going to be to drought. If you want the best leaf to stem ratio, you want to graze as much of your forage as possible, because the regrowth is always going to be leafier, because regrowth always includes leaf and stem. So if you leave a lot of stem, you're going to get more stem along with some leaf. If you don't leave any stem, you're going to get some stem growth, but you're also going to get a higher percentage of that growth as leaves. So if you want to improve your leaf to stem ratio, and what sensible grazer wouldn't want that, graze stuff lower. You'll end up with much more palatable forage, much more energy, a lot more energy in your forage. So it's just kind of a no-brainer. So hopefully all of this has made sense. I know it's probably going to rub some people the wrong way, and I don't mean anything. I do not want to disparage any of the well-known grazers out there. I'm just telling you, if you've paid attention to the advances and what we've learned about grass and soil over the last decade, your long-term organic carbon, which is what makes this whole system go, it doesn't form the way we used to think it formed. And that's another video for another day. But suffice it to say, if you want to stop overgrazing, leave less behind and increase the amount of recovery time you've got in between your grazings. Get around your farm slower, and you're going to find that your good stuff gets more opportunity. It also does a better job of recovery, and you're going to put pressure on the stuff you don't want. Graze selectively, and you're going to put little or no pressure on the stuff you don't want, but the good stuff's going to get pressure on it anyway. I mean, even if you were worried about your solar collector, which I'm telling you, don't worry about your solar collector after grazing. That's what that whole recovery was about. The recovery is not just about growing new leaf. Recovery is about putting new energy back in the roots. But even if you were worried about the solar collector, grazing a third didn't leave much solar collector at all on this Bermuda. I mean, right now, they're grazing Bermuda that's been grazed down to the ground like this, and they're still refusing this Dallas grass. If I left them in here for another 30 minutes, all they would do is try to gnaw on that soil and gnaw on what little bit of Bermuda is left. It's like watching someone gnaw on the rind of a watermelon trying to get the last little bit of fruit. So thank you to all our subscribers out there. If you're not a subscriber, please click the subscribe button. That helps us out a lot. And what also really helps us is if you like the videos. The more people that like our videos, the more YouTube will recommend them to folks who haven't had an opportunity to learn about what we're doing out here. And the whole reason we do this channel is because I just want people to know that there's a way of grazing and managing your livestock and your pastures that is much better for your family, much better for your soil, and very importantly, much better for your bottom line. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and wish you all a great weekend. Thank you.